Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carlos Kalmar. I'm the music director of the Oregon Symphony. And thank you. Since Robert is somewhere, Robert McBride, I thought
I'm pitch hitting for Robert right now.
I just told Jonathan Greeney. This is our principal timpanist of the Oregon Symphony, Jonathan Greeney. And I just asked him 30 seconds ago whether he wants to do this, and he rolled his eyes and said, "Don't ask me any history questions." But one thing that we can ask him for sure, no, that's fine, is we have a complete program that utilizes timpani in each work. However, drums over there. However, you have two different sets of drums.
That's right.
Why?
Well, I play for the Mozart. I actually play these small Viennese drums called Schneller Kerbelpauken, and they have calfskin heads on them, actual calfskin, and I use wooden mallets. And I guess the idea behind it is, if we were playing in a Baroque ensemble and the Baroque musicians would be using instruments from the period of the time that the music was being composed, I would be playing very small Baroque drums with wooden mallets or maybe leather-covered mallets, because that was the kind of sound and style of the instruments of the time. But as music has progressed, so have instruments. And we obviously are not a Baroque orchestra, so there will be a lot of the woodwind players that are playing modern instruments. So the drums that I'm actually playing, which you can't really see from here, but if you're up there you'll be able to, are they're kind of in between a large modern instrument and a small Baroque instrument. And so they kind of bridge the gap, and the reason why I like to use it is I love early music, and I like that style. But I wanted something that would also have the volume and power to hold up with a large symphony orchestra. And so it's kind of, I guess, my desire to be somewhat early period, but still having the power and volume to hang with a large group as ourselves. And then in the second half, I go to my modern instruments, which are much larger drums. And as of now, I'm playing with plastic heads and felt-covered mallets, and so those are much more powerful, and they work much better for the Strauss than the smaller drums that I would use for the Mozart.
So in terms of, I know you said no history, in terms of years, so you know kind of the span of years that we have to cover. The Serenade by Mozart that you're going to hear in the first half was written in 1779. I don't know why I know that, because actually I'm very bad in history. And the Strauss pieces, one of them, The Death and Transfiguration, was written at the very end of the 19th century. And the four last songs were written pretty much 60 years later, 55, 60 years later, 1946 to 48. One thing, let's just talk. This is a musician, an expert. Let's talk something that you probably never asked yourself. But this is an opportunity, because I know there is a difference between Baroque, the little drums, and the big drums. Maybe not on yours, but technically, how do you tune a drum? And what's the difference? Because I know there is a difference.
Yeah. Well,
because, I mean, I don't know whether you ever noticed that when an orchestra tunes, this is an opportunity for you to see what an orchestra musician does. You see the concertmaster gets up, she tunes the orchestra, and you see him putting his ear next to the drum and gently going like this. And then he does something, but what does he do?
It's a good question. So the first thing, I guess, to understand would be just a basics in understanding maybe just the simple physics. So if you're playing a string instrument, you have tension and the length of the string, and those play as to the pitch. And if you pluck it and you watched it very slow, it would vibrate at a certain frequency. If you play a reed instrument, the frequency comes from the actual reed buzzing, and then a brass, the pitch comes from the buzzing of the lips. Well, timpani, actually, from the physics standpoint, is one of the most complicated because of if any of you have ever taken physics or even calculus, circular tension. Have you taken physics?
I forgot.
So there's circular tension, and there is a pitch when you hit the drum. If you were to look at it from scientific diagrams, it's not just like a wave, a sine wave that you would see with a lot of the other instruments. It's moving, and there are different conflicting waves that are happening on the drum. And so in order to get a very clear pitch, hey, Robert, in order to get a very clear pitch, you have to have the tension of the drum around the drum has to be even as you can make it. And once that is even, you get the clarity of the pitch. And by clarity, I mean when you hit the drum, you hear one pitch, and not that pitch fundamental, but then some weird overtone and some weird thing. And if you have a drum that's out of tune and you play it for somebody, they might say, well, that sounds flat to me. And then you might tune it up, and then they'd say, well, it's actually, I don't know anymore, because something happens to the pitch of the drum, but also there's some strange overtone that's on one of the other channels of the waves that's vibrating on the head. It's very complicated. So what we have to do is do our best, because it's never going to be perfect. So we do our best to try to make the tension equal around the drum, and then once we have that, that's our starting point. Then we have two ways to tune the drum. One is with a pedal, and the pedal is through a mechanism that actually will pull the hoop that has the head attached to it down around the drum in an even fashion. And there's also a hand crank, and the hand crank does exactly the same thing as the pedal. But they call the hand crank the fine tuner. So you move the pedal to kind of get you where, a ballpark, and then you use the fine tuner to kind of just get it exactly where you want it to be. Now on my early drums, the Kerbal-Pauken, which that actually means is crank drum, there is no pedal, because there was no pedal in older drums. It was just the crank. But on my modern drums, I have a pedal and I have a crank. So once I get all these things working for me, then I do have things on my modern drums that help. There are gauges, so it's just mechanics. Once I move the pedal, it moves this rod that is pointing at these little letters, and it gives me a ballpark. So that if, for example, in Strauss, or doesn't happen in Mozart, because Mozart the pitches stay the same, but in Strauss I have to tune, and so I will play something, and then I have to tune very quickly, and then come in. And the gauges help quite a bit. And then if I'm a little bit off pitch, I can either move the pedal a little bit or I can move the crank. So it's very interesting. Once you set the pitch, it generally is good. But that's only the case on plastic heads. With the calf heads, they have humidity problems. So if it gets dry, they start to go up in pitch. If it gets wet in the humidity of the atmosphere, they go down. So I don't know if any of you noticed, I just walked on stage before I came out here, and I put these sponges, essentially, filled with water inside the bowls of the drums. So the calf is such a wonderful sound, but it's very temperamental, so to speak. And so you're constantly messing with it, you know?
I think that you would never have thought, coming to a pre-concert talk, that you would get a lesson in physics. And second, you get a very clear understanding why in the end I decided to be a conductor. I have to deal with my baton, that's it. It's very, very easy. And we have Robert here.
We have Robert.
Jonathan, this was brilliant.
Thanks. Thank you. Robert, good to see you.
No, wait a minute. Did you take the heads all the way off so you could put wet sponges inside the drums?
No, there's actually a hole drilled under the bottom of the drum, specifically designed so that you can put a sponge in there.
Will that stay in there for the duration of the concert?
Yes.
In order to keep the humidity more consistent?
Yes, yes.
Now, when you hear a recording, say on the radio, you just turn on the radio, can you tell if the timpanist is using plastic or calf heads?
It depends on the quality of the recording. If it's a modern recording and the microphones are such that that you can actually hear a little more, I guess, presence of the instrument, then actually I can sometimes. It gets a little difficult when you're adding felt, a lot of felt, fluffy mallets, and you're playing, and through the recording, sometimes you can tell, sometimes you can't, but when you get harder mallets, could be hard felt, or it could be closer to wood, there's this quality of calf that's just as great. And you know, Maestro Kalmar, he conducts a lot in Europe. I would guess that there's a lot more Europeans play calf than plastic, or maybe you've never noticed.
Well, actually, I think in the old orchestras, meaning 25 years ago, but on our day and age, I think everybody goes to plastic. I think it's easier to handle.
It's much easier. The big the top 5 orchestras in this country, or maybe even close to the top 10, they all play calf. And I think they do that for a reason. And I know in Berlin Philharmonic they play calf. In Stockholm and Gothenburg they play calf. So a lot of people. It's very expensive and it's scary. And people are like, well, why would you pay more money and have more time? I was just talking to somebody about this recently, and they're like, you have 2 kids. Why do you want to play with calfskin? And
because it's easier to deal with than the 2 kids.
Exactly. That's exactly what I said in response. So we'll see. I'm actually toying with the idea of potentially putting calfskin on my big drums. Maybe next year. I don't know. I'm thinking about it. So if all of a sudden it sounds really out of tune, that's probably the reason. But hopefully I'll be able to figure it out because the quality is nice. And if you talk to brass players that sit next to timpanists, most of them will say, "Oh, there's nothing like calf." You know, there's something about the quality of this.
It's a warmer sound. It's a more organic sound. It's a little bit like the difference between butter and margarine.
Yeah, that's actually a great comparison.
Which means it's very Portland. Yeah. Organic. Come on, we agree.
Yeah.
So when will you be a guest on Portlandia?
That's a great question. Great question.
I'll put in a good word for you.
Right.
Maybe 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boy, did I... He is such a good guy and such a good musician, and he's so much fun to watch. He's really got style when he plays.
Jonathan is phenomenal.
Yeah, I want to apologize for being late. I got stuck in ridiculous traffic. I was coming in from the west side, and there'd been an accident on 26.
That's okay.
When you got to hear from one of America's great timpanists. I was a Paukenschlager when I was in college. It's great fun, but...
Yeah, because everybody pays attention to you.
You sort of feel like the second conductor, kind of. Or maybe third after the concertmaster.
Well, actually, that is the truth. I mean, it's Sarah, our concert master, she is my right hand, if you wish. He's my backbone.
Oh, excellent.
Just talking about timpani for just a few seconds, if you have a timpanist who is not, aside from being musical, of course, which he is, and have a great sensitivity to color and to style, if you have one who is not absolutely accurate, you cannot imagine how much in trouble you can actually get. It's the backbone. If he's rock solid, then you have a great help.
Yeah, and all the brass will be playing right there with him, and the winds and everybody else. And when you guys do Beethoven 9 soon, not only will Jonathan be playing his little timpani with the calfskin, but in that charming Turkish march in the last movement, they'll be using a small bass drum and these little Turkish cymbals to get just the right sound. That's the level of detail that the percussion section in this orchestra brings to what they do. It's great.
And we didn't even get Jonathan in this case to talk about, because he was always talking about leather, wood, and God knows what felt he has. I think that these guys, timpanists, have, they always have sticks in pairs, probably 50 pairs, different. Each one makes different sound. It's quite a science.
And you'll see him changing frequently during the Strauss pieces. And some timpanists make their own sticks. They've got their lathe down there in the basement, and they're making the wood. Okay, where were we? Where were you?
Actually,
what do you want to talk about?
We were, actually, we only started at the Mozart and we immediately went into timpani because, I mean, having Greeney here, I mean, let's talk about timpani. How many times did you come and talk to a timpanist? And how many times did you actually hear that he puts a sponge in his instrument? This is new. This is exciting.
I didn't
so
know
now
he
we
had-
can talk about the music.
All right, I didn't know he had 2 kids either. So, you know, I tried to scare up an actual posthorn to use as a prop tonight, but I was unable to do that because the Mozart Serenade is nicknamed the Posthorn Serenade. You haven't talked about this?
No.
Okay, because in the next to last movement, for a little while, he writes a part for this little thing that was a precursor to the bugle, a little horn that doesn't have any valves. And in Mozart's time, that instrument was used to announce the arrival of the mail coach into town or to announce its imminent departure. So you knew the mail was coming, or you knew you better scoot down there and give your letter to the mailman. Now, I don't know if the mail carrier is the guy who played the posthorn, or if he had a horseman with him, or if it was one and the same person. Do you know?
Historically, I don't know that. The fun thing about this Mozart piece is that it's labeled the Posthorn Serenade because of 1.5 minutes of
true.
music out of a piece that is 44 minutes long. I mean, we are talking, the interesting thing is we're talking here about a long Mozart work. I mean, this piece is longer than probably 95% of his symphonies, this serenade. And his other big serenade, Hafner, is, I think, even a little bit longer. It's quite astounding. Yeah, he wrote Posthorn. This piece is, when you think about how the program goes tonight, the first half don't search for something in that music by Mozart that is not there. What I'm talking about is on our day and age where we probably know a little bit about Mozart. So we know Austrian composer, and we know he wrote 41 symphonies, and he died in poverty, and you don't know where he's buried because he was so poor, etc. And that during his later years, meaning when he turned 28, that's his later years, his style of writing very often had something to do with operatic style. You always can hear, oh, yeah, there are his operas. And his style also had something to do with drama. In the sense there was always this search for depth in his music. Don't look out for that. The serenades are just for fun. They have nothing else. It's just fun music. And the phenomenal thing about this is that the music is so amazingly good, although it's so incredibly simple. One of his most famous, in a way, serenades, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, starts, you probably know that music is tin, tan, tin, ta, pa, 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 ti, ta, ti. If you once reflect, okay, what did I just hear? How simple is that? It's incredibly simple, but still is one of the most popular things we have ever heard in music. And the serenata, the Posthorn Serenade is exactly like that. It's just larger in scope. Has many, many movements, has a fast movement. It actually follows the tradition of what a serenade is. An array of many movements, fun to play, probably being played just for the amusement of the rich people at the time it was done. And in the middle, very likely, it will have something to do for somebody in the orchestras, in the sense of play some solo right now. And in this case, we have 2 movements that are very clearly dedicated to the woodwinds. They have a lot of things to do, fun stuff. Now, the only thing that has to be said about this Posthorn Serenade, aside from the fact that there is a posthorn for 1.5 minutes is two slightly curious things. One is, and don't ask me why, I don't know it. In the same movement where the posthorn happens, just a minute before, a piccolo flute makes its appearance. Why? No idea. For 1 minute. Piccolo. Very strange. Why is it there?
It was a union thing.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing is, maybe there is more tradition to this is a serenade that follows this idea of kind of fun, pleasure. So everything is in major key, with the exception of one movement. And that movement, Mozart kind of utilizes to some extent to show a little bit of a different side in him. And that is very fascinating to hear that. After all this, you feel, I think, in this music kind of the arrival of the king, and you feel the majesty of the music and people dancing, if you will. And then there is this a little darker piece. And then, okay, then comes the finale. Not more to it. There is nothing you have to interpret into this music. It's just fun.
And then there's intermission.
Yep. And then let's
Half
go
time.
interpret. Yeah.
You can have a glass of wine, if you wish. Then Strauss, Richard Strauss, a composer that conductors love to conduct, because there's so much going on in that music. It's so rich. It's rich harmonically. It's rich in terms of the colors that he asks for. And in this case, you've got two pieces, one written when Strauss was in his mid-20s, and then these four last songs that were written when he was in his mid-80s, and he didn't even hear the premiere because he had become demised. And they're linked, in one case by an actual theme, and they're linked by the theme of death and transfiguration. And they go together so perfectly. And I've never heard them in concert like this together, and I'm happy to have the chance tonight. Thanks for doing that.
And you're going to hear them. I'm not the first who does that. I admit to that. But we are going to play them back to back without applause.
Oh, excellent. So does that mean that Amber
Amber is going to be here.
She'll be on stage for the whole second half?
Yeah.
Just sitting there absorbing all that music.
Amber said, let me hear some good music.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah.
So she'll just stand up and you'll launch right in. And the first of the songs has that quality anyway. It doesn't have like a long, slow introduction or anything. It's like, okay, she's here. Let's go.
Let's go, exactly. You know, in the case of Death and Transfiguration, this is a very, let's say, from its thematic material, a very serious piece of music, because actually it's a tone poem, and you could, if you wish, follow a little history, meaning an old man lying on his deathbed, dozing off, and you hear kind of a little bit how he dreams at the beginning, and you hear his heart pumping very softly and irregularly. And then all of a sudden there is a momentum of, he wakes up very suddenly and turmoil happens and his illness takes over. And during this struggle of the next couple of, let's say, maybe 15 minutes of music until he dies, you hear, not only he's struggling, you hear so clearly his heart. Literally, the heart, you hear it. But you also hear him remembering when he was young, his childhood, and all of that is put into music, and then he finally dies. And I think you can even hear, and then comes the introduction to the Transfiguration. Now, the interesting question in that piece is, what on earth makes a 26-year-old write such a piece of music? Specifically, if that person is not somebody who is the most serious, over-emotional person. Strauss was actually a very, in a way, highly intelligent and very well-educated guy, but I mean, he was not really what you call a very complex character. He's simply stories about him rank from not really, this famous story when he bumped into Gustav Mahler, who was crying and just didn't care, from Strauss was a very famous conductor, from looking at the watch while conducting and speeding up the tempo because his friends were waiting for him to play cards. And still there is this piece, but why on earth? Death and Transfiguration? Oh God. And in Death and Transfiguration, in the middle, in the struggle, there is this wonderful, amazing theme. And at the end of the 4 last songs, at the end of the last song, that theme comes again. So that's where the linkage is. And it's fascinating that he utilized the same theme, but what you also will hear is actually a great genius composer maturing. Here is the young, hugely energetic, swamping over with sound guy with mainly death, and even the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration part is so beautiful. And then comes 60 years later, the old wise man. In a way, well, the way I could describe it is less unnecessary stuff. There is still the Straussian point of view and his harmonics, but it's not so much like, no. And the piece, the 4 last songs, 4 songs, gets simpler as we go. And the last song, which is, singers, conductors too, just worship this piece. Because if you actually can do it well, and if your singer, like Amber Wagner, really does it brilliantly, you are in heaven, and you travel through the music with this long breath. And specifically, the great thing about the ending of the piece is that the last song describes an old couple, probably in their 80s, looking at the setting of the sun. And that is a symbol for the setting of life. And they look and the sun sets, and the last thing they say is, looking into the sun, as they ask, is that perhaps death? And after that word comes the theme from Death and Transfiguration, meaning it is death, and that's how the piece and the concert will end. It's quite an amazing journey.
It is, and the most sublime music you'll hear all night is at the very end of that very last song. And it's so beautiful. It's so worth it when you get there. Did anybody see a documentary film a few years ago called The Audition? Yeah, I see a few nodding heads. It was about the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions process. One of the primary means by which young singers can eventually find themselves on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, Amber Wagner being one of them, and she was featured in the film. I haven't met her yet, but she seems like a delightful human being.
I have to give one thing away about Amber Wagner. We are talking about a very young woman. She's young. Not going to say how old she is. We are talking about a major career, and despite the fact that she was born in Northern California, since she was 6 months old until I think she finished high school, where did she live? In Hillsborough. So it's our own.
Now, you've worked with her before.
Oh yeah.
So can you tell us a little more about her and what she's like to work with?
Wonderful to work with, very easy to work with, very musical, and you just fall in love with this voice. Because it's, you know, when you are a young singer and female, what are you? You are very likely to be a light lyrical soprano. All of them are. Amber is actually there. That's a voice. I mean, it's quite a big voice.
That's the kind of voice that Strauss loved writing for, and it's funny, singers love to sing this stuff if they can, but it sounds really difficult to me. It sounds like it would almost be torturous. Some of it's very high, he's changing key all the time, but they love soaring on those waves, I guess.
Well, the thing about the difficulty of this piece, the first song is really difficult to sing, very high. But the real thing where you know that your singer is working very hard is breath control, because the lines are insanely long, and you keep going and you keep going, and then you find this pocket of breath here, and then another one here, and wonderful.
And Strauss married a singer, one of his leading sopranos, and they stayed together forever until their sunset.
Another story about Strauss' character. He met Pauline de Ahna, his wife, and he was playing the piano and accompanying her. And the first time they met, he accompanied her. He had written the songs, and they rehearsed, and she couldn't pull it off, and she got so agitated. She said, "I don't want to sing this crap." Needless to say, that he immediately fell in love and married her. Man.
And then tortured all sopranos for the rest of his life by writing this kind of stuff for them to have to sing. But you'll love it, because it really, really is beautiful. I think we need to wrap up. All right. Thank you very much for coming to the pre-concert chat. I know you'll enjoy the concert. And remember not to applaud when Amber Wagner stands up, right?
Oh, don't worry. It will not happen.
Okay. Thank you. Carlos Kalmar.
Robert McBride.
And Jonathan Greeney.